Hello everybody, and welcome to the Drydock episode 403. This week the questions are taken from guides 471 and 472 on the ironclad HMS Defense of 1861 and the Spanish ironclad Numancia. The Wednesday videos are Naval Engineering building a wooden warship and the 10th Destroyer Flotilla, and the Friday video was about what is a battleship and why did they end up being replaced. Hollywood asks, "Hey Drac, I'm sure you've mentioned a few times about various ships that have been sold for scrap but then sunk on the way to the breakers. Who's responsible when that happens, the Navy or the breakers?" It depends almost entirely on what exactly the contract says. And the reason for that is that with some contracts, when a ship is sold for scrapping, the Navy in question says, well look, we have a ship. It is here. It is available for scrapping. If you want it, you can buy it, but if you buy it, it's yours there. If whatever you want to do with it at that point, well, that's up to you. Just we don't want it here anymore. At which point, obviously, the breaker, or the shipbreaker, has to arrange for the ship to be towed. So at that point, if the ship snaps its cables and sinks or goes aground, well, that's the shipbreaker's problem because ownership of the vessel left the Navy and went over to the breakers at the point of sale while the ship was still moored up in its port. On the other hand, sometimes the contract will specify that the breakers will take ownership of the vessel, but only if it is delivered by the Navy. So obviously at that point, if the ship is in transit and something goes wrong, it's still technically in the ownership of the Navy, so it's the Navy's problem. And sometimes there's, depending on the level of risk the breaker is willing to accept, or indeed sometimes the distance. So you see this perhaps more so in the US, because in the UK, even if you're a breaker halfway down the coast and the ship is for sale in Scapa, it's only a tow of a few hundred miles. Whereas in the US, if you buy a Navy ship for breaking up, that ship could be thousands of miles away from you. And you don't really want to have to pay for any of that. So again, in some cases, the negotiation will be, well, the Navy wants to get rid of this ship. If the Navy brings this ship to this location, a given port where the breaker yard is, then we will buy it off them. So in the case I described previously, the shipbreaker will have bought the ship, but as part of the contract of sale, it remains essentially the Navy's problem till it gets to the breaker's yard. Whereas in this case, the ship is entirely the Navy's, and it's entirely down to the Navy to move the thing to its eventual point of breaking up, and only then will the breaker actually pay for it and say, yeah, okay, this is our ship now, go away. So in the first case, it's entirely the breaker's problem. In the latter case, it's entirely the Navy's problem. In the intermediate case, it depends very much on exactly what the contract says, because the ship might be under Navy control, but technically is property of the breakers. Rupert Foulmouth asks, "I'm curious as to what benefits were offered by Chinese junk-style vessels. It appears even after contact with Western-style ship hulls, the junk remained very popular. Was this just tradition, or did the hull type actually offer something that made it favoured?" There were a few advantages that the junk style had, and bear in mind, junk is kind of especially in the Western world, a kind of a generic term for ship that looks kind of like this. But overall, the advantages that the junk had for, especially in Chinese waters, were that because it didn't have a keel, it didn't require single massive timbers the way that Western ships did. So it was actually somewhat easier to put together from various sources of wood because, well, the maximal timber that you needed, maximal size timber you needed to build one was smaller. Therefore, they were smaller, cheaper, and quicker to build. The internal bulkheads helped, but they were as much structural to keep the thing together because it wasn't keel and rib based. So I wouldn't necessarily say that was a massive advantage, except, of course, when you were flooding, which at that point something's already gone horribly wrong. But one of the other things you'll notice in both photos and depictions of junks is they have these ribbed sails. And because they have these ribbed sails, they require far less rigging. I mean, you can even see in this depiction the amount of rigging necessary on the war junks compared to the Nemesis, which is in the background there, is far less. And that means that, again, cheaper, quicker to operate. And also it means that a smaller crew can furl and reef and deploy the sails compared to more Western-style sails. And finally, in terms of major advantages, the junk is a very shallow draft vessel. So for operating up and down Chinese rivers and in Chinese coastal regions, because remember the Chinese were mostly doing the kind of isolationist thing at this point. They'd abandoned the big treasure ship ideas quite a while ago. The junk was actually very, very handy for this. So essentially it was a small, cheap, low crew, shallow draft option, perfect for high volume merchant trading all around the Chinese coast and river systems. If you wanted to take it further out to sea in deep ocean trade, there would be some fairly significant drawbacks, but the Chinese weren't really interested at the time in all that much deep ocean trade, so it didn't really matter, compared to a European ship of a similar size, which would have needed a larger crew and not been able to go into quite a shallow water. Maciej Kroll, I think, asks, what do we know about the White Ship? Most accounts I've found in my cursory search focus understandably on its fate and the state of drunkenness of everyone aboard, but about the ship itself, all I managed to learn that it was either new or at least newly refurbished, and that it had a mast and oars, and that's pretty much it. Well, the descriptions of the White Ship don't really help all that much, because they're relatively brief, and they're heavily contextual. You know, they're written in a style that very definitely suggests that when the author is describing it, he's assuming that people know what ships of the period look like, and he's just noting kind of some of the key differences. With that said, we do have some issues with artistic depiction, because artistic depiction can go all over the place. You'll see in this picture, for example, it looks very much like not so much a Viking longship, perhaps a Viking trade vessel, and that's probably closer than most. There are various period, or no, not period, but close to period depictions. But the problem is most of those are still from the 1300s, which is about 200 years after the ship actually sank. Bear in mind, when it sinks, that we're only talking about 60 years after the Norman invasion. And we know from the Bayeux Tapestry that most of the ships the Normans were using were, not exactly dissimilar to Viking vessels, which isn't a surprise considering the Normans were descendants of the Vikings. And even in the depictions from the 1300s, the depictions themselves vary quite a bit. There's some artistic work where it looks very much like a 1300s era cog with a forecastle and an aftercastle and so forth. There are other depictions from the period that look considerably more like a much simpler Viking-style vessel with a single mast and obviously a whole bunch of oars. Now, the initial temptation would be to say, okay, well, it's probably derived from a Viking Nar, and we know that the Nar, along with other ships, evolves into the classic medieval cog, so maybe some kind of hybrid featured vessel, but probably more resembling a Nar than a cog at that point. The cog being kind of, as I said, the medieval vessel with the fore and aft castles distinctively. We know it's got to be fairly large. It's attributed to having had 300 people on board, although it was overcrowded, but still, a vessel that you can overcrowd with 300 people and still remain upright, it's still going to be fairly substantial by the standards of the time. My only hesitation with saying, oh yeah, it's just a big Nar with some of the early signs of evolution into the classic cog, would be that they clearly thought, albeit drunkenly, that the vessel was fast enough to overtake the king's ship and make it back to England ahead of them. And we do know from some Norse burials that kind of the royal yacht style, if you can call it that, did trend a little bit more towards what you might loosely call the Viking longship or the Viking dragon ship than it did towards the Nar. So if we're noting that, okay, this is a royal ship, it's a very, newfangled vessel, it's supposed to be really quick, then that would be kind of my only hesitation with saying it's definitely a Nar type. It may well have been a general Nar type just to get to the sheer size of things, but I would think it was possibly also strongly influenced more by warship, aka longship design, to give it that extra boost of speed, because the one thing Nars were not, it was fast. Ironblood Enjoyer asks, if Spain had the industrial capacity to do so and World War I had never happened, how effective would the Reina Victoria Eugenia class battleships have actually been? I think a lot of that depends on exactly which version actually ends up getting built, because you have the initial proposal, which has 8 15-inch guns, then you have the revised proposal based on the state of the Spanish economy, which has 8 13.5-inch guns and about 21,000 tons and 21 knots, and then you have the final version, which they were kind of looking at, which would have been about 25,000 tons and went back to having 15-inch guns. Now, I think if we take the latter two options and consider them briefly, the last option, a 25,000 tonner at 21 knots with 8 15-inch guns, I think would have been quite effective for Spain, because that would give her a firepower which is on a par with other modern capital ships of the time. The speed, it's nothing to write home about, but it's nothing particularly terrible either. It's kind of standard battle line speed. But when you look at similar ships like Revenge, which is why I pulled up a picture of Revenge, because of course the Reina Victoria Eugenias were never built, so this is about the closest you're going to get to seeing one. The Revenge class displaced considerably more. Now, there is some talk about the fact that obviously they're not designed to have as long a range, and also they weren't necessarily designed, like the Revenge class were, to resist their own guns. They were designed more to face off against 11 and 12-inch guns, which of course would have meant lighter weight armour and so forth. So, potentially you could squeeze 8 15-inch guns and protection against kind of the last generation of naval guns onto 25,000 tons. They still would have been fairly tight designs, though. Now, for the scenario that the Spanish are envisaging them being used in at that point, therefore, which is basically against the Mediterranean powers that don't include the Royal Navy, that they would have been perfectly fine long term. In the interwar period, they still would have been relatively powerful ships. They could have been refitted and modernised to a certain degree in the 1930s, again, assuming Spain's economy allows for it. Their one limitation at that point would have been a similar limitation, but perhaps even more so, as that found with the Revenge class, which is that because of them being very compact, tight designs, there just wouldn't have been a huge amount of space to put upgrades in. And that kind of would also apply to the 8 13.5-inch gun option, because it was, again, a step down in size. So although it's a smaller armament, it's still a very, very compact design. That design would obviously have a slightly shorter shelf life, because while by the late 30s everybody's still rocking 14 and 15-inch guns for the most part, with a few 16-inch thrown in there as well, while a 13.5-inch gun would be at the lower end of those margins of firepower, and if the armour is only designed to resist 11 or 12-inch weapons, and it's relatively slow, and as we said, doesn't have a huge amount of scope for upgrades, it's very much going to be a second-line ship in its 13.5-inch format. Well, to be honest, even by the 1920s, when you get the first 16-inch ships wandering around. Although the interesting thing is, in both cases, they would actually be more powerful than the Italian battleships, which initially have 12-inch and then later 12.6-inch guns. So that might have been an interesting thing. Almirante Brown asks, I recall reading in a book about the economic history of Latin America that Paraguay built several warships when it was part of the Spanish Empire. Is that true? If so, how many and what type of vessels were built in Paraguayan shipyards, and what was the largest vessel Paraguay built for the Empire? I don't know for certain, but the big problem is, of course, Paraguay is landlocked. Now, it does have access to the sea via rivers, and Asunción was quite an important inland shipyard and repair centre for Spanish ships when South America was under Spanish control. But the vast majority of the ships built at Asunción were coastal, well, not even coastal, riverine vessels, essentially, so small craft. Now, I could see in the classic age of sail perhaps Asunción being used to build brigs or sloops or schooners or something like that, which could then be taken downriver and used in local oceanic defence. So that potentially could be the thing. Also, Asunción is quite an old city for a European-founded city in South America, And so it's theoretically possible, if you go back to the earlier age of sail, that it could have built galleons or carracks or something along those lines, because those kinds of ships, while beginning to come to an end, and the recognizable kind of great ship frigate and then standardized ships of the line were coming in at the time, older designs of say, galleon and caravel and small great ship and early frigate could potentially have been of a size where they could be built at Asuncion and then sailed out into the open sea. But the sources, if they exist at all, for shipbuilding of that kind of period at Asuncion are either very patchy or entirely in Spanish, and while I can read Spanish, finding them on the Spanish internet or in Spanish-speaking bookshops and stuff will require me either to go to Spain or South America, I rather suspect. So I don't know. It's a possibility, but if I was going to put money on classic Spanish imperial warships being built in Paraguay, it would have to be kind of in the unrated, 12 to 18 guns brig, sloop, schooner section. I certainly couldn't find any significant records of frigates in the classic 22 gun plus age of sail context being built there. Fabian Zimmerman asks, as you often point out, with the exception of Algerie, French heavy cruisers essentially had no armour. The officers and sailors of the Marine Nationale must have been very well aware of this, so how did they plan to fight with these cruisers? Did they create a specific doctrine to try and minimise their weaknesses? What was the plan if enemy heavy cruisers showed up? Was it to only fight with numerical superiority, only fight at long range, or something else? As far as I can tell, French battle doctrine for things like Suffren here, at least in the interwar period, seemed to envisage using the heavy cruisers as a kind of gigantic flotilla leaders for the contre-torpilleur and torpilleur squadrons. So they'd be out as part of the fleet screen. Okay, that's a fairly standard role for cruisers. But they seemed to be mostly, as a doctrine, designed, or at least specified, to fight against enemy destroyers, at which point, obviously, with 8-inch guns and high speed, they could outrange them and just hit them from beyond the destroyer's ability to hit back, to engage smaller cruisers, so older cruisers, which presumably would also have range issues and, probably would, again, have difficulty hitting them in the first place. And in the face of anything more substantial, the idea was to fall back, allow the torpilleurs and contre-torpilleurs to, as appropriate, to drop in torpedo attacks, and then let the capital ships take over. Now, of course, there was the possibility that someone might rock up with a modern cruiser, which at the time of their design meant a big 8-inch cruiser with some armour, which could defeat something like the French ships in a straight-up gunfight. And in those cases, depending on the exact year, the tactic seems to be either engage them at very long range and use your speed to keep that range open and hope for the best, or, as I said, fall back on the capital ships and let them do the work, rather than risk anything substantial being punched into your non-existent protection. And while that could work in certain circumstances, I do think it's a valid strategy, but I do think it's a very flawed strategy, because it essentially relies on the enemy doing what you want them to do. And if they have ships that you haven't accounted for, like something like, say, a Zara class, or, ironically enough, a super destroyer like the French were building, because a super destroyer would be even faster, at least in calmer sea states, be able to close the range down, being a little bit larger might be able to tank 1 or 2 hits, and would have fast-firing guns of a reasonably substantial size, which could then obviously pose quite a threat to something like a Suffren. And I think, to a certain degree, the Marine Nationale was very well aware of the limitations of their early heavy cruisers, and they were building a doctrine that was more a doctrine that was designed around the limitations of their ships, rather than necessarily the doctrine they actually wanted for ships of this size and firepower. They were, as I mentioned when I talk about these things, very held back by the state of the French steel industry in the 1920s, because if they thought that this was a perfectly viable way of doing things, they would have continued building these instead of switching over to Algerie pretty much as soon as their steel industry allowed them to. BK Zhong asks, With all the value of different woods for shipbuilding, were there any armed conflicts fought specifically over access to specific types of wood? To a certain degree, yes. When it came to building the hulls of ships, you basically had to have your own sources of wood in your own country because you needed so much wood from so many trees that importing wood to build a significant sized navy was just completely impractical. Of course, if you were a small nation with only a token fleet, you could do so, but at that point you're not really on the table of the great powers. Now, of course, you could have situations where your overseas ambitions netted you places that got you access to even better wood, like the Spanish having control of much of South America and, well, what we now call Central America and the Caribbean, meant that they could build various ships out of mahogany, which is really tough, albeit a little bit heavy, but nonetheless. But Spanish shipyards, as in shipyards in Spain, were still capable of building ships using Spanish wood rather than wood from South America. Obviously, if you could do both, that was better. Similarly, the English used English oak, the Americans used a mixture of white oak and live oak, because that's what they happen to have there. And so if you were in a situation where you were fighting an armed conflict over your wood supply, it meant that either your homeland had been invaded, in which case it's probably a bigger conflict than just whether or not you get access to certain timber, or in the case of the Spanish, you're in the middle of losing most of your overseas empire, which again is a somewhat bigger issue than just the wood supplies. However, mast timber is another matter entirely, because mast timber, or at least the timber that's good for single-piece masts as opposed to composite masts, that is much rarer, and you don't need anywhere near as much of it by terms of volume to construct your vessels, and so at that point you can, to a certain degree, afford to source your mast timber from overseas, at least if it's really good quality. So you might have some local sources, and of course you can always use composite masts, but for the absolute best, if you can afford it, and if the trade routes are open, then you would try and get the best tall, straight, single-pieced mast timber. Now, for a long time, Britain had an advantage in that there was loads of this kind of wood growing in what later would become the United States, and they were quite happy with this. However, once the US got its independence in the latter part of the 1700s, then they had to look elsewhere, because Britain, for all its other timber-growing properties, didn't grow huge amounts of particularly brilliant mast timber. So they started getting it from Sweden, along with various other ship fittings like bitumen and so forth. But mast timber was a very important part of it. And then, fast forward to the very start of the 1800s, literally as in the first decade of the 19th century, you have the League of Armed Neutrality. And the League of Armed Neutrality was an attempt between Russia and Denmark and a couple of other places to, well, depending on your interpretation, either tacitly side with the French or try to stand alone against both British and French aggression, or any number of other things. Again, historians have differed quite a lot on what the true purposes, as opposed to the stated purposes, of the League of Armed Neutrality were. But as far as Britain was concerned, the single biggest problem with the League of Armed Neutrality was that it held the potential of being able to close off access to the Baltic. If you closed off access to the Baltic, you closed off access to Sweden, and if you closed off access to Sweden, then all that nice, good mast timber was no longer available, along with, as I said, all the other bits and pieces they tend to buy from the Swedes for naval stores. And if you're in the middle of a knockdown, drag-out existential conflict with revolutionary and later Napoleonic France, that just isn't going to do. So the Battle of Copenhagen in 1801, led, of course, by Nelson, is almost entirely predicated on Britain wanting to get access to that Swedish mast timber. Momarathe asks, how do reduced flash charges work, and what are the trade-offs if there are any? So, broadly speaking, reduced flash, often called flashless propellants, although that's not strictly true, work by two primary means, and someone who's got a degree in chemistry can probably educate you in even more details, but essentially you add additional chemicals to the mix of the explosive, as well as changing the ratios. And this does two primary things. Firstly, By changing the chemistry of the explosive, you can change what gases are produced by the combustion of the explosive material. Because obviously some gases that are produced, like say hydrogen, are extremely combustible. So when they escape into the open air with a huge amount of heat present, oh look, they catch fire. Conversely, other types of explosive produced vast amounts of nitrogen, which doesn't matter how hot you get it, it's basically never going to ignite. So that's one part of it. And the other part of it is, again, by changing the chemistry of things, you can reduce the temperature of the combustion. I mean, of course, reduce the temperature of the combustion, less energy, which means that even the still ignitable exhaust gases or waste gases from the combustion of the material, if they don't have as much energy, A, there's less chance of them igniting, and B, even if they do ignite, and obviously there's less of them anyway, but if they do ignite, then they're going to ignite with somewhat less energy, therefore burn slightly less brightly. So those are kind of the two things. Change the combustion gas output and reduce the overall temperature of the explosion itself. Now, are there trade-offs? Yes. And there is actually a benefit apart from the reduced flash. It also usually comes along with reduced smoke, but the other benefit is you get reduced barrel wear. But that's kind of a two-edged sword, because the reason for that is one of the bigger problems is that because you have a cooler explosion, less energy, therefore less muzzle energy for the shell, therefore the shell doesn't go as far. So either you have to increase the amount of propellant if you want to use your standard ballistic tables, or if you're going to use the same weight of propellant, you have to accept that you have a shorter range and you actually have to devise a completely separate ballistic chart for using flashless powder. Now, of course, in World War II at night, you're not going to be engaging at 25,000 plus yards, generally speaking, so it doesn't actually matter that you have slightly shorter range. As long as you've got a different range table to base your calculations off of, the fact that your guns are shooting slightly shorter is absolutely fine, because you're going to be opening fire at thousands of yards or maybe tens of thousands of yards, which your guns can still perfectly adequately reach. But obviously, if you were going to try and engage for some reason, perhaps with radar-controlled gunfire at 25,000, 30,000 yards, you could start to have problems. The other issue is that because you are introducing more chemicals and changing the basic makeup of your propellant, the whole thing becomes a lot more expensive and a lot more complex to produce. So let's say a £100 charge of flashless cordite, or more accurately reduced flash cordite, will cost more than the same charge in regular cordite. So it's more expensive ammunition. And those two reasons combined is why it's only ever really kept around for night actions, because during the day you want to be able to shoot far, and you don't really want to have to massively increase the costs of your propellant if you can avoid it, because during the day they can just see where you are. The fact there's a big muzzle flash probably isn't going to change all that much. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, have you seen the recent video by Brother Monroe where he goes over how frighteningly well the old rating system works for modern vessels? What are your thoughts on this, and do you agree with the assessment? Yes, well, actually, this is something, some people might remember the old bilge pumps podcast that myself, Jamie Seedle of Armoured Carriers, and Dr. Clark used to do. We actually proposed this a few years ago as a way of rating ships, because we're just getting fed up of everything modern just being called either frigate or destroyer, when you can have frigates that are clearly bigger and more capable than some destroyers, obviously destroyers that are smaller and less capable than some frigates, and at the extreme ends of both, tiny, tiny, tiny frigates and really, really, really big destroyers, which are orders of magnitude different in terms of actual capability, whereas if you just look at frigate and destroyer, you'd expect the frigate to be less capable, the destroyer to be more capable, but the capabilities to be somewhat close to each other. And it's just not the case these days. So the idea was essentially to go back to age of sail rating systems, where you have first rate, second rate, third rate, fourth rate, fifth rate, sixth rate, unrated. And instead of counting number of guns, you would count number of weapons. And there was some discussion over, do you count number of weapons total? So do you include the deck gun, potentially things like ASROC or Harpoon launchers, and as well as your surface-to-air missile launchers and things like this? Or do you make it a bit more restrictive? But that's kind of devil in the details. But yes, broadly, I think it's actually a fairly good idea. As I said, there are some issues when it comes to counting exactly what weapons are what. So, I mean, I would argue that, yeah, deck gun counts. I would argue a CIWS system probably doesn't. Obviously, your main surface-to-air missile system, which is usually a VLS system these days, that counts. Your surface-to-surface missile launchers, whether they be Harpoons or Moskets or Tomahawks or whatever, that definitely counts. The main sort of tripping up factor comes when you get to missiles which can be quad-packed. So, for example, I believe you can put Sea Sparrow quad-packed in the same cell you can put an SM-2 in, at which point are you counting the number of missiles, or are you counting the cell? And in those cases, I've generally taken the point of view that you should count the cell, because the cell is clearly designed for a larger missile, so normally it would just be the one. And also, usually if you quad pack into a larger cell, those individual smaller missiles are less capable. So you might have more of them numerically, but capability-wise, although it's a different form of capability, you probably haven't added or taken away massively from the ship's overall, in that case, defensive capability. And I think then, as a kind of a rule of thumb, when you go, okay, well, this is a first rate, this is a third rate, etc., 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 I think that actually works to give you a very quick reference as to this is how capable this ship is relative to this other ship. Now, of course, there are going to be significant differences in those details, which you might then need to go into further. For example, different missile systems have different performance levels. You could make an argument, and I know this is all very much post what the channel normally talks about, but it is kind of related to the old age of sail, and, well, it's my channel, so I guess I'm taking a little bit of a detour here. But so, for example, you could argue that Sea Viper, the system used on the British Type 45 destroyers, is perhaps a more capable missile system, certainly when paired with its radar, than a standard SM-2. But then you get into the argument, well, that same VLS cell can, on an American warship, for example, can hold an SM-3 or an SM-6 and the SM-3 will have anti-ballistic missile capability, which currently the Sea Viper doesn't. So you're still looking at, a silver cell and a Mark 41 VLS cell. But I would argue these are just essentially, they are a cell each, so they count as one. What exact weapon system you put in them and how precisely capable it is actually has a rough analogy back in the age of sail, because if you were looking at, say, a third-rate ship of the line, classified obviously just by the number of guns, the third rate might, if it's a French third rate, have a 36-pounder lower gun deck. If it's a British third rate, and 36 livre, so actually even slightly heavier. If it's a British third rate, it might have a 32-pounder main gun deck. If it's a smaller third rate, like I say, a 64 gunner, it might have a 24-pounder main gun deck. And similarly, the upper gun deck might be 9-pounders in some of the smaller earlier third rates, 12-pounders, or 18-pounders. And all of that, along with are you firing canister shot, double shot, chain shot, etc., all of that actually affects the overall capabilities of a ship. So you could end up with, say, a French 80-gun third rate showing up with 36 livre lower deck guns and 18-pounder upper deck guns, and it goes up against an early 64 gunner that has 24-pounder lower deck guns and 9-pounder upper deck guns. And yes, that's a horrible mismatch, even though they're both third rates. But firstly, it's nowhere near as horrible a mismatch as if either one of those ships went up against, say, a fifth-rate frigate or a first-rate ship of the line. And secondly, just by going, this is an 80-gun third rate and this is a 64-gun third rate, there would be a certain amount of inherent understanding that, exact weight of fire aside, one ship has 16 guns more than the other. It is going to have an advantage. It's then just a matter of quibbling the details of exactly how much of an advantage. And so I don't think the precise capabilities of those missile systems actually really comes into play all that much. Where you might have some interesting issues is where perhaps a ship has a very large battery of surface-to-surface missiles compared to another ship that might have almost exclusively surface-to-air missiles. And those ships do have very different capabilities, even if their missile counts might be similar. But again, these are details rather than necessarily dismissing the whole rule of thumb as a quick guide. So, for point of reference, a more recent Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, for example, it has 96 Mark 41 VLS cells, 2 triple torpedo launchers for anti-submarine torpedoes, so you're already up to 102 individual launch systems, plus a deck gun and 4 to 8 surface-to-surface missiles. So at that point, it would technically classify as a sort of 108 to 110, if you like, gun equivalent. So it would be a first-rate ship of the line, not necessarily the heaviest first-rate ship of the line, but a good, solid first-rate. Whereas a Type 45, well, at the moment that has 48 VLS cells, a deck gun, and in theory, either Harpoon or NSM launchers, which would take it to a total of just a fraction over 50 weapon systems, which would make it a very low-end fourth rate, which, depending on the time period in the age of sail, would either be the absolute minimum end of a ship of the line or a heavy, very heavy frigate. In theory, if they get the 24 Sea Scepter silos that they're supposed to have later on in this decade, then that would, of course, push the total weapons system count from just over 50 to, in terms of just VLS cells between the existing ones and the new ones, you'd be looking at 72 plus NSM launchers and a deck gun, which would put it firmly into a fairly heavy third-rate category. Bearing in mind that the third rate is from above 60 but below 90 guns. Warrant Officer Will asks, after the Battle of Drydock Sound, aka where Blucher was sunk, Admiral Oskar Kummetz, the admiral who'd been on board Blucher, was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross for the engagement. Why? Was he given this as a "congratulations, you survived" award, or did he take some notable action that most accounts of the battle gloss over? So, according to the citation for which accompanied the award of the Knight's Cross, he wasn't given the award strictly for the Battle of Drydock Sound, because, well, yeah, that would be a bit silly. Essentially, he was given the award for his overall command of that element of the German Operation Weserübung, the invasion of Norway, because although he had lost Blucher, he and Lutzow badly damaged enough that she had to withdraw. He then, obviously surviving, organised the retreat of the German naval force, got them to land their troops elsewhere, and thus, despite having Lutzow badly damaged and Blucher completely sunk, he actually managed to succeed in his objective of capturing Oslo with less than a day's worth of delay, which, given the disaster of Drydock Sound, was actually quite an accomplishment. Now, it did take a little bit longer to bring Oscarsborg Fortress to heel, and the delay did allow the Norwegian royal family, some of the government, and the Norwegian gold reserves to all make it off into exile, which did have some impact further down the line because it gave Norwegians a literal and figurative flag to rally around to form both resistance back in Norway and the Free Norwegian Navy and so on and so forth. But, as I say, given that you've taken an invasion fleet up a fjord, had your flagship blown out from under you, had your next most important warship badly damaged, and you still fulfilled your objectives with less than 24 hours delay, that's actually quite a feat. And that is what he was given the Knight's Cross for. The German High Command seems to have essentially written off the loss of Blucher as, well, we thought that fortress was unmanned and non-operational, and that's what we told him, so can't really blame him for believing what we told him and unwittingly sailing the whole thing into a trap. Nathapron Hongsheron asks, how exactly does US armour provide the best protection in the world against small shells, heavy cruisers and so forth, but absolutely horrendous protection against large shells? The figures in Nathan Oken's table show that against the US's own 8-inch Mark 21-5 shells at 4,000 yards, those shells can penetrate 12.4 inches, which is comparable to Italian armour, which is at best 12.3 inches, but against a 16-inch 45 Mark 5 at 26,000 yards, it needs 15.1 inches to resist compared to the Italians' 12.5 inches. I can wrap my head around the different thicknesses of armour requiring different percentages of face hardening, but why does shell diameter have any impact at all? Essentially, it's our wonderful friend the square cube law, because if you increase a linear dimension by a given amount, you're increasing surface area by the square of that and the volume by the cube. So, using your example there, 8-inch and 16-inch, obviously a 16-inch shell is double the diameter of an 8-inch shell. And while that means it has 4 times the surface area, although exactly how that relates to the particular surface area of the armor-piercing cap is a little bit more complicated, it has 8 times the volume. And therefore, assuming that the overall proportion of explosive to shell is approximately similar, you're going to end up with actually a great deal more force being exerted on the armor for a given square inch with the 16-inch shell than an 8-inch shell, as well as the fact, obviously, there's just more energy generally because it's a bigger shell. The actual energy per square inch is considerably higher. And because you're dealing with both more energy and more concentrated energy, then the physics of how the armor responds to the shell is going to change. Again, I do need at some point to do a very in-depth video about that interaction, but it is a very complex engineering subject. But essentially, if you want to go into, at least for a dry dock answer, a relatively crude descriptor, what you're looking at is, like you mentioned, you need a different percentage of face hardening. So essentially, when you are looking at a smaller shell, a 6-inch shell, an 8-inch shell, something like that, the mass of the incoming shell and the energy of the incoming shell distributed over the area of the impact is such that the best way to resist it is what you might call a complete resistance, i.e., or in common terms, no selling that hit. And for that, more very hard material to just stop the thing cold is better. Hence why the US, with its very thick face hardening, works really well with its armor against those smaller threats. Whereas against a bigger shell, with, as we just said, the 8 times the internal volume and the greater energy density, the overall amount of energy in the given concentrated area has gone up to a point where any reasonable hardened steel is going to fail. I mean, sure, you could have a hardened steel, block of armor that's 30, 40 inches thick, and that might no-sell the shell. But in realistic terms, that face-hardened section should break up or disrupt the armor-piercing cap to an extent, but anything beyond that, whereas against a smaller shell, it would just resist the incoming shell body, on the larger scale, anything beyond that is just going to fracture because of the sheer amount of force being projected through that armor plate. And because obviously it's brittle, similar to glass in some ways, compared to the softer steel at the back, that fracture, once it starts at the face, which is going to happen, it propagates, it becomes very weak, so therefore penetrating through the rest of that hardened face is much, much easier for the big shell. And then, of course, there's relatively limited, more ductile material at the back to continue to try and resist. Whereas if you have a thinner face, basically just enough to break up and or disrupt the armor-piercing cap in the first place, and then the rest of it is this much more ductile material, the softer back, that can spread out the force of the impact over time, even though we're talking about changing the distribution of energy by fractions of a second. In this case, it actually does make a huge difference. you end up with the shell actually being more likely to be defeated, especially given that you're just going to objectively have more for the same thickness of overall plate. You're going to have more of this ductile material with a thinner, hardened face. I suppose one crude analogy might be if you're trying to stop a speeding vehicle and you've pre-planned this, having those kind of raised spikes that rip out your tires that they have on some gates and so forth, as in like, you know, raising and lowering gates, and then a gravel stopping area like they have on truck runoffs behind that. So if a car is going relatively slowly, which in our crude analogy is a smaller shell traveling with less energy, then if you have, let's say, 4, 5, 6 rows of these spikes, you rip apart the car's tires, and then the friction of hitting more spikes plus the fact that, well, the car travels less efficiently with its tires gone means it comes to a halt pretty quickly within those spikes, and the gravel is essentially there just as a bit of a backup. Whereas if you have a car traveling at extremely high speeds, which in our analogy would be your bigger shell traveling with a lot more energy density, you only really need to rip out the tires. And once you've ripped the tires out, the fact that there are more spikes doing even more damage to the tires doesn't actually manifestly slow the car all that much. Yes, there's friction acting on it, but because it's got a lot more energy in the first place, and the spike strip areas are quite hard, the car continues to roll, losing a minimal amount of speed, and therefore if you only have a shallow gravel stop area, there's a much greater chance it's going to run through the gravel and keep going. Whereas if you have only 1 or 2 rows of spikes and a really deep gravel area for your high-speed car, your spikes have done what they need to do. They've just ripped out the tires, and then the long gravel area kind of soaks up the rest of the energy. It's not a perfect analogy, but I think it hopefully gets across the general gist. The Rogue Chief asks, piggybacking off the question from Drydock 395 Part 2 about ships' doctors' powers, in the Hornblower TV episodes Mutiny and Retribution, a key plot point is the ship's doctor ruling the captain of HMS Renown medically unfit to command due to his unstable behaviour, and the ship's officers trying to wrest control from him both before and after said ruling. My question is, how realistic would this exercise of medical authority be, and would the lower officer's actions be excused given the circumstances of the captain's actions, whether with or without a medical ruling? Or would it still be considered, to quote Pellew in the same episode, black bloody mutiny? So, in either case, there would be some kind of inquiry or court-martial or whatever the Admiralty wanted to term it afterwards. But a huge amount of it would depend on exactly what the captain's actions were. Obviously, in this case, in the episode, it's made fairly clear what the captain's actions were, but talking about it from a slightly more objective viewpoint from whatever court or board is convened afterwards, for an attempt to, presumably successful, to remove the captain before a ship's doctor has said, this man is clearly mad, take him away, the captain's actions would have to be extremely egregious to the point that you would essentially not so much be arguing that the captain had gone mad and therefore needed to be relieved, you'd be arguing that his actions directly contravened one or more significant sections of the Naval Code of Conduct or the regulations, because at that point you could say, look, this man was doing this, and that contravenes these regulations, and therefore, because he was in contravention of all these regulations, we were under an obligation to remove him from command. So, I mean, to use a completely wild example, it is obviously both treason and a capital offence to set fire to one of the king's ships. So if the captain had gone so mad as to run down to the magazine with a candle, yelling that he was going to, ascend to godhood by, blowing everybody up, clearly at that point, even without a medical doctor's intervention, the officers could argue that what they were doing was not mutiny, they were saving the ship from someone who was clearly, essentially, all else aside, going against naval regulations and violating them in a fairly major way. Whereas so essentially, is he putting his ship in danger, or is he putting the interests of the Navy in danger. Whereas if he's, quote unquote, only making some questionable decisions that are not strictly in breach of naval regulations, then just because you disagree with them, and even if you see a pattern, what you would be doing by removing him at that stage would still be mutiny. Now, of course, they may, depending on the circumstances, choose to be a bit more forgiving about it, but you would still technically be mutineering. The flip side is, once the ship's doctor said, no, this guy's clearly a lunatic and we need to do something about it, then you essentially have a third party, if you like, to point to say, look, clearly you cannot have a madman in charge of one of His Majesty's ships, and the one person on board who is qualified to say who is and is not mad has said he is mad. Therefore, it is our duty to remove him from the ship, or not from the ship, but from command of the ship, to ensure that all the other regulations are followed and the ship is well led in action, battle, and to fulfill all its other missions, at which point you basically have cover for your actions, and the Admiralty would just say, okay, yeah, that's a fair point. That he's been judged mad, his actions were clearly mad, you did your duty, carry on. DM Phoenix asks, Drac, when it comes to submarine design, are you on team single hull or team double hull? Broadly speaking, I would be on team single hull, but with some fairly significant caveats. And for those of you who are wondering, a double hull is what it sounds like. You have the internal pressure hull, which is usually cylindrical, with an external hull built around that. Whereas obviously single hull is, here is the tube, and with a few fixtures and fittings on top of that in certain, bow, stern, maybe a little bit of casing up top. So, for example, the submarines that you can see here, the US R-class, these are single-hull submarines because the vast majority of what's facing the sea is the pressure hull, and yeah, there's some casing on top, but that casing doesn't surround the entire ship. There is some debate. Some people will call things like the German Type 7s and Type 9s single hull or double hull. Technically speaking, they are single hull because they have a bit of external casing at the bow and stern. They have casing running across the top. And while they do have saddle tanks, which are kind of an intermediate between single and double hull, when you go underneath, you discover that they are just saddle tanks. They don't wrap all the way around the pressure hull, and therefore the pressure hull, being substantially exposed directly to the sea, makes it still, technically speaking, a single hull design. And the reason I say with caveats is that while I think personally a double hull ends up being a lot more expensive and takes a lot longer to build, while it does give you a little bit more internal space in the pressure hull, you could just make the pressure hull a little bit larger. Yes, it slightly increases the expense and so forth, but submarines are fairly expensive anyway. And the last thing you want to do, to be perfectly honest, is to have a big, impressive-looking submarine, and then when you get inside, you discover that the pressure hull is actually absolutely tiny, and the vast amount of the volume does virtually nothing for the crew. But there do have to be some concessions to hydrodynamics, and certainly in the time period of the channel covers, when submarines are spending more of their time on the surface than they are underwater, at that point, this kind of intermediate approach where you have, yes, a single hull design, but with extensive casing, is probably the best, because single hull designs are more common these days because they do pretty well underwater, but most modern submarines spend most of their time underwater. But if you're going to spend most of your time on the surface, you need that kind of almost ship-like construction to keep you stable and running at speed. And even once you get to mostly underwater staying designs like the Type 21 and 23 in the time period of the channel covers, and then nuclear subs after the time period of the channel covers, there are still some issues around hydrodynamics that aren't fully solved by just having a torpedo-like hull structure. You might want your bow shape to be slightly different for sonar, for agility, and the same thing for upper casing, particularly for underwater agility. So while I think the single hull is the better overall design idea, I think in almost all cases you are going to need a reasonable amount of casing for various purposes, whether it be for surface running or underwater speed and agility or whatever. So not true full single hull, which would just be, here is tube with pointy bit at the front and propellers at the back and perhaps a sail or conning tower on top. Andrew Kirshenman asks, I find it interesting which your most viewed videos are on YouTube. Which one are you most surprised with how many views it has, and which one did you think would have way more but doesn't? I think of all the videos that I've done that have notched up well over 1 million views, the one that I'd look at and go, hang on, why? is probably the one about the US mothball fleet. That's actually sitting pretty high up the rankings with just over 2 million views at the time of recording. Now, of course, I put videos out in part on the basis of, hey, I think this is quite interesting. But while I made that video thinking, hey, this is actually quite an interesting little side piece of naval history, I certainly wasn't expecting it to be that popular. I was expecting it to do reasonably well, or hoping it would do reasonably well, but that well? That's another matter entirely. And if we, say, look at videos that have less than 100,000 views, obviously there are some videos that I've published more recently that maybe haven't quite reached that, but then most of the videos that have got 1 million plus views have been around for quite a few years. They've built up repeat viewing and long-term viewing. So it's perhaps a little unfair to look at very recently published stuff, but I would say of a video that's been out for a while that's still got less than 100,000 views that I thought would do really well, probably a good example, albeit it's only just under 100,000 views at the moment, would be the one I did on the development of night fighting techniques in both the Japanese and US navies. Because, it involves the Japanese Navy, which seems to always be a permanent draw. It involves night fighting, which is quite exciting, and it involves a comparison between the two major navies of the Pacific, which also tends to be relatively popular. And yet it hasn't really taken off compared to some other videos on the Japanese and US navies. Why? I'm not entirely sure, but that is the will of YouTube, I guess. Tankodromis asks, why did Krupp insist on using horizontal sliding breech blocks instead of using vertically sliding breech blocks? This would eliminate problems with space next to the gun needed for the breech to slide. The breech could slide into the gun pit and the rate of fire would stay similar. Partly, I suspect, tradition. Krupp, certainly in the first half of the 20th century, seems to be very much a we have always done it this way and therefore we shall always do it this way kind of company. At least when it came to artillery. But yeah, you might wonder, why don't you just turn the things 90 degrees? I think that there's separate issues there. Firstly, if you are going to, say, have a, like you seem to be suggesting, a downward dropping vertically sliding breech block, that means your gun pit is going to need to be slightly larger to allow for the swing of the thing, and particularly there's going to need to be a bit more empty space immediately below the guns in their loading position, and their loading position can't be particularly high, otherwise you need even more space in your gun pit, and the area in the gun pits where the gun pits are is already in fairly high demand, because you've got obviously the shell hoists and the charge hoists coming up and all sorts of ancillary equipment immediately below the guns themselves. So intruding on that could be seen as somewhat problematic. The other problem, of course, is that when you're trying to close the thing, that breech block weighs a fair amount. Now obviously if it's a downward facing breech block, it's going to open really easily, but if you need to then close it, you've got to have enough force not just to move it, but to move it directly against gravity and maintain a proper seal, which is obviously it's going to require more machinery, more powerful machinery, which is going to increase the overall size, weight and cost of the guns, as compared to horizontal sliding, where, yes, obviously gravity is still a factor, but you're sliding it along rather than upwards. Therefore, you don't need quite as powerful set of machinery to close the breech blocks. Also, it would be a bit of a maintenance nightmare, because if anything goes wrong with it, you've basically got to have people hanging out in free space in the gun pit to try and work out what the heck has gone wrong. The flip side is obviously you have it vertical, a bit like the guns on the Des Moines class cruisers, and that potentially could work a bit better. Obviously, you've got gravity helping you close the breech blocks. You do need more machinery to open them in the first place, but that's less of a significant safety hazard than an improperly closed breech block. But, of course, it does then mean you need space in the turret roof, because if the turret is going to be loading at either flat or very minimal degrees, you might need to raise the turret roof slightly, which is going to increase the overall height of the turret, which is more space and weight. Whereas if you have them horizontal, although obviously you do make the turret overall footprint somewhat larger, and therefore that's also, yes, increasing space and weight, it's a slightly less of a major target profile than if you're increasing the height. So I think that's kind of why they went with that. But ultimately, as you know, my standing principle is that sliding breech blocks are good for rapid fire and small caliber weapons. Honestly, they're just, whatever orientation you have them in, they are a pretty terrible choice for large caliber naval artillery, simply because of the space that they take up and the efficiencies that you could get with interrupted screw breech block. Will Sanders asks, howdy Drac, if the US Navy managed to sell the South Carolina class before the Washington Naval Treaty, who would have been the best customer to make use of them? How useful would they have been if they were modernized along the lines of the German pre-dreadnoughts in a World War II context, particularly along the lines of a Sverige class in terms of acting as a deterrent? Well, I keep racking my brains, and I keep just coming back to the Greeks. For the Spanish, you could argue the South Carolinas are arguably a better battle line unit than the Espanias, but they also represent a slightly retrograde step of the vertical triple expansion engine as opposed to the turbines, which, for all their other faults, the Espanias are at least turbine-powered. All the South American dreadnoughts are more powerful than the South Carolinas. The bigger navies, like the British, the French, the Italians, they're not going to want them. And so, yeah, I just keep looping back to the Greeks, especially if in this alternate timeline either the Greeks haven't bought the Mississippis or perhaps they offer to trade them. So, a small cash sum plus returning the Mississippi class in exchange for the two South Carolinas. Because overall, the Mississippi is a triple expansion engine, so it's no real knock on the Greek Navy if they also have the new ships. Obviously, double the armament in terms of 12-inch guns, better armor, slightly newer, a little bit faster, albeit, yes, only a little bit. Doesn't need a huge amount more crew. In actual fact, only about 100 or so more men. And I suspect you could probably significantly reduce that by cutting down on the secondary, tertiary batteries and having perhaps fewer, heavier 4, 5, or 6-inch guns. And then if, again, somehow the Greeks had had the money to do a modernization, kind of like what happened to Schlesien and Schleswig-Holstein, then I think they could have been pretty useful. I mean, they wouldn't necessarily have deterred the Italians or the Germans because they're coming by land, not by sea, but when you look at Schlesien and Schleswig-Holstein, they actually did have reboilering, which could have potentially increased their speed, but they instead chose to use the space to turn the spare space into cadet training areas. If the Greeks are similarly modernizing their South Carolinas with new boilers, replacing the secondary battery with anti-aircraft guns and this kind of stuff, new fire control equipment, then I think they probably would go whole. Well, again, assuming they've got the money to throw at this, you might as well go whole hog and go, well, if we're replacing most of the machinery, we'll stick some turbines in anyway, instead of the vertical triple expansion engines, and then using the combined space, we'll put in a bunch of modern boilers and maybe push the ship up to 20, 21 knots, something like that. Maybe put a little bow extension on there to help as well. But at that point, although it's not particularly going to scare modern fast battleships against, say, the Italian refitted dreadnoughts. Now, the Italian ships will have somewhat more guns. They're still going to be carrying 10 guns versus the 8 on the South Carolinas, but the South Carolinas will be more heavily protected. And the Italian ships will have the advantage of speed, but that's less of an issue when you're playing coast defense, because obviously the enemy has to come to you. So I think they would be a much more powerful deterrent for naval efforts. And if they're newer and if someone spent all this money modernising them, then the Greeks are far more likely to use them a little bit more proactively. So it's less likely that they're going to be caught in harbour the way that Kyklis and Lemnos were. And instead, probably these refitted, modernised South Carolinas would be able to flee with Georgios Averov, which would be a rather interesting situation because, of course, Averov was put on Indian Ocean convoy escort work for the most part. But if the modernizations manage to push these things up to 20 or 21 knots, then for at least as long as the Mediterranean fleet has the old R-class floating around in it, you might as well tag these things along as well. They're not going to slow the fleet down anymore, and it provides firepower that's going to scare off Italian heavy cruisers and, as I said, is a reasonable matchup for the Italian refit ships as long as they want to throw down. That will probably be a fairly short span of time before the Mediterranean fleet moves over to a slightly faster battle line overall. But they'd still be very useful, fairly powerful convoy escorts for the Mediterranean convoys, shore bombardment vessels, and there'd probably be a great amount of symbolism in them, taking part in the various Allied offensive actions in the latter stages of the war, invasion of Sicily, invasion of Italy, very ironically enough there, and other liberation of Central and Eastern Mediterranean Axis holdings. And that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. And of course, next week is the Patreon Drydock, so settle in for that one, but I'll see you then.